Good evening, folks. I wanted to spend a little bit of time tonight. For some reason, my live stream camera isn't working, so I'm going to go ahead and record this and upload it separately. Um, but yeah, I want to talk a little bit about artifacts tonight in cultural geography. And last week, I actually had the a really nice thing happen. So I was able to go out and spend the day with some friends, and we did a day trip out to Doylestown. And that's sort of north of Philadelphia in Bucks County. And I haven't been out there in quite a bit. It's actually a very cute little town, and it's known for several significant historic buildings there that were built by Henry Mercer. And Henry Mercer, I think, like, he was from a family in Bucks County, and he inherited a bunch of money from his aunt, and so he went to Penn and studied law. But didn't really like studying law, and was very interested in archaeology and anthropology. And so when he came into this big pile of money, he sort of pursued that for the rest of his life as sort of a gentleman intellectual and amateur and informal architect. And he lived in the early 20th century, and a lot of these three buildings, the Mercer Museum, Font Hill, which is his residence, was his residence, and the Moravian Tile Works were all built out of poured concrete. And it was very novel at the time in the teens. That was not typical that you would have concrete construction. And it was very sort of organic. I don't know that he had blueprints all planned out, but it evolved, over time, and it was sort of very fluid, and they're very unique buildings. And so Mercer was also really interested in handcraft. And so this was at the time, again, the turn of the last century, where things were shifting from hand-produced items to mass market items. And so the Mercer Museum in particular became a space for him to display his collection of objects of handcrafted items. And then the other part of the handcrafting was this Moravian tile works, and it was based on the tile in Moravian stoves, I think, and in other. But he interpreted the patterning from the stoves and reinterpreted them as sort of these modular, sort of folksy tiles that often told a story, that were figurative and had symbolic meaning to them. And these were tiles that, again, remember, in the 19-teens, this is part of sort of the arts and crafts era, and there were a lot of people building estates and using these tiles in various governmental, sort of monumental governmental structures, like the state capitol in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as well as other kinds of estates. So I first knew them because I was an intern at Rinaldi House in Winston-Salem, and that was the original home of R.J. Reynolds, and they built a large estate according to, like, the sanitary movement with concrete, and actually Charles Barton Keene, I think, was the architect. He was a Philadelphia architect, even though this building is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a Moravian community. And so they had a lot of craftsmen from the Philadelphia region that did work for Rinaldi House, and that's how I knew about it. So there were these Yellen iron work, and then the Moravian tiles were there as well. So it's very interesting, these tile work. So I had a lovely afternoon with a couple friends, and we set an intention in a labyrinth nearby, and we spent a lot of time looking at artifacts. And so I wanted to revisit a couple parts of the maps that I've been working on and talk a little bit about artifacts. But, like, within the context of this afternoon, so we came in, and there's sort of a new entry area to the Mercer Museum, and there was a docent, tour guide, and it was a self-guided tour, but she wanted to sort of chat with us. And of course, I had been just recently doing some of the looking into with Swedenborg and the Moravians in London. And so I was asking her some questions, and we were talking about Winston-Salem. And, she was very interested in sort of what we were doing. She was sort of engaged. And so we left off, and we were exploring the museum, which has this very high gallery and things like hanging off the ceilings. It's just like a full crazy attic, like a concrete, amazing, crazy attic. And if you're ever in Doylestown, you should definitely go. And then so it's around a central sort of courtyard that's enclosed, and then it's maybe like even 7 levels up. Little stairs, and all of it's concrete. And then there are little cubbies along this corridor, sort of wrapping around either side, with natural light, coming in, and then each one is sort of a little picture box of different crafts, right? Like, barbering or cooking or um, uh, everything. There was even a gallows. I don't know that you consider that a handcraft, but there's a gallows on the top floor. These cast iron stoves, furniture, a pharmacy, all kinds of things. So it's a very unique, special place. So we're looking at these artifacts, and we're about halfway up, and the tour guide shows up again. And so we were looking in, I guess, the area that was the cobbler area, the shoes. And she's like, "Oh, well, come here. Let me point out the shoe to you. See this very large shoe?" And then she tells the story of the shoe, that it belonged to a freed slave, and someone who was very tall and had a very big shoe size. It was very notable, the size of the shoe, and that he was sort of a very big man, very tall as well, and so he had escaped from a plantation and made his way north. But because of his physical characteristics, he was sort of noticeable because he was such a big person. And eventually the slave catchers came and took him back. And then within this community, ostensibly, I think it was the Quakers, they pooled their resources to go down and buy his freedom and then bring him back. And so she was telling us this story about the Quakers. And, I really couldn't help myself. So there's actually another gentleman in this group. And so it turns out the other gentleman, sort of who happened to be nearby hearing the story, he later says, like, oh, like he's talking about that he's from Long Island, which is, again, where we just came from the whole trip with my friend Liz on Long Island. He's from the North Fork near Plum Island, and we were exploring the South Fork. But, all of Long Island is sort of this radar frequency-based system. And so I listened to the story, and I'm nodding, and I'm like, but the thing about the Quakers is they were against slavery, like at an individual level, but institutionally, many of the most powerful Quaker families were involved in banking systems that were benefiting from the slave trade, and Lloyd's and these various groups that at the higher levels, the Quakers on the front end were against slavery, but in a certain level, certain Quakers, powerful Quakers, were benefiting from the slave trade. Even though maybe not up front, they weren't directly buying and selling slaves themselves, they were doing the financial trading for the banking. And then the banks were doing that credit work. And that's all about this innovative finance tied to human capital, which ultimately the human finance tied to human capital is tied to human potential and signals trading in the multiverse. So I thought that was really interesting. So I gently sort of pull back the thing, on the wonder of the Quakers and say, it's a little bit more complicated. And she was a little consternated because it wasn't just in front of us, it was also in front of the Long Island guy. So we, anyway, and actually when we were first coming in, so I pulled in, and I was screwed up because it was the daylight savings time thing, and I'm totally checked out of society. I don't even know it's the daylight savings time day. And I kind of remember, and I set the clocks in my house, but I didn't set the clock in my car. And Doylestown is about an hour away, and I got mixed up, and I thought we were supposed to meet at a certain time, and I thought, I've got plenty of time. I'm going to stop and get a coffee. Only it was daylight savings time, and I actually didn't have that much time. So I was like hustling. I finally realized, like when I went to the parking meter, I'm like, it's an hour difference. Oh no, I actually need to be at the place. So I'm hustling to get some coffee because I left. I was distracted before I left the house, and time got away from me, and I didn't have my coffee. So I said, I made a little chat with the guy at the counter, and I was like, yep, we're going to the Mercer Museum. And he said, well, you should be sure to look for that rock, because there's a rock with a pictographic carving on it of a mastodon. And there's some sort of mystery around this rock and Henry Mercer having this rock, but they don't keep it on display. So you'll have to ask for it. I'm like, noted. Okay. This feels like one of those things in the game. So you go to get coffee, you're running late, and the guy says, make sure that you look for the rock with the mastodon on it. And so, so we go in and we ask the tour guide initially. We're like, and because there's actually in one of the cases, like a little notebook with a sketch of the pictographic drawing, the petroglyph that I think he's talking about, because you can see there's sort of a drawing with a figure and some spears. And I'm like, I think this is the mastodon. So I asked the tour guide, and I said, see this picture? Someone was telling me about the rock that you could see with this pictograph. Could you tell me where it is? And she's like, oh no, it's not on display. So she doesn't offer it, okay? So this is important later. So as we're making our way to the very top, and literally she's like, you should go see the gallows at the top. I'm like, oh, okay. So there's a lot to see. So eventually we sort of were like, well, let's just go to the top and we can work our way down depending on how much time, because we were going to have lunch. And so we get to the top of the gallows, and it's like you walk in and you're under the gallows looking up. And we thought, well, this is very odd. And under the gallows is a standing fan. So it's, it's an older building and it's concrete. And so I think maybe there was a leak or something. So they have this tall, like, person-sized standing fan, maybe for circulation, of air circulation, maybe if there's a leak. And it's bright yellow. It's this chrome yellow that we're seeing everywhere. And, my friend and I, like, we knew that the color imprinting of this yellow is this chrome yellow that represents in alchemy, the alchemy of the soul. So it's quite fascinating to have this bright yellow fan. Like, bright yellow is kind of an unusual color. I mean, I don't know, under the gallows in the soul, right there. So we're up on this higher level with the gallows, and we see there's like an exhibit under construction. So it's almost like sort of, don't look here because this is not anything to be looking at. We're doing something over here. But in that space, we walked in and there was the case, and that was where the rock was. And it actually, I think if I'm remembering correctly, it was like a rock that was meant to be worn at the neck. Like, I can't remember the particular name of how the piece was, but it was like a stone that looked like it was supposed to be worn. So a medallion. And so anyway, I thought that was quite interesting. And so the woman told us it was not available. It was clearly available. So we're going on the way down, and I see her. She's wearing like a bright green dress. And we've been talking about the Emerald Gate and the Emerald Gate Foundation. I'm like, she's in an emerald dress. And so I kind of like nudged her on the way out. I'm like, we found that rock. I couldn't help myself. And then she's looking at us, and she's very clearly kind of consternated with me. And I wasn't mean about it. I was just like, hey, we found it. And so she looks at me like under the steely eye, and she's like, so what do you do? Now, remember, we're in a museum of a man who trained for law and came into a bunch of money and then decided to do his own thing, his own independent investigation for years and years. And I was like, well, I'm a cultural geographer. And I quilt, and she's like, well, what does that mean? And I'm like, well, I study the story of places, and that's what we're here today, to study the story of places. And again, if you think about these artifacts, these were handmade artifacts. And so as we're thinking about the field and correspondences between the material world and the spiritual world, these artifacts all have story attached to them, and they have history, and those histories have their own signatures, like their own energetic signatures. And it's interesting, if you read The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, like part of the storyline is that the masses of people, the material items that they live with are created by matter compilers, which are kind of like, this is written in the early 90s, but like the equivalent of like a 3D printer or nano printer or something like that. But they're all made of the same matter. And so they're functional, but they're not lovely. They're not exquisite. They're not unique. They're just, they keep you alive, right? But they're not objects that are imbued with feeling per se. They're disposable, right? And then when you're done with the thing, you throw it back in the matter compiler and it'll make you a different thing. And that's what the poor and the working class get. But the venture capitalists in the story, they live in a compound and they actually get handmade items out of natural materials, which is a very potent distinction in the storyline. And there's sort of an element to this societal differentiation between the rich, who have access to what we might consider natural things that are made with a human intention behind them, and the matter compilers. And I think that's interesting because as someone who does make quilts, right? When I make a quilt, it has an intention with it. It's done with a certain energy of it being a gift, because the quilts I make are gifts. So it's like I can see the importance within now. I'm starting to understand the field dynamic and the energy that's carried with objects. What this museum and what all museums maybe really are about. And, and I love museums. I mean, I grew up and I read, what is it, from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basiley Frankweiler, where the girl and her little brother uh, get a train ticket from the New York suburbs and go to the Met and take all of the change out of the fountain and sleep in the beds. And, you know, as a geeky kid in the 70s, I loved that story. um, and so, yeah, I kind of always had a thing for museums. But now I understand a little bit more about what actually it is. Um, that it's part of the energy field, these artifacts, and that Mercer collecting them, and again being at Penn, so Penn has his own. No, this is the early 20th century, but also being independently trained in archaeology and anthropology. And there's a lot of indigenous findings in and around Bucks County. It's interesting to think about him caretaking all of these objects that are at the cusp between the handmade period and the machine made period, and that machines making objects maybe have less of an intentional soul to them than handmade craft, and this was during the arts and crafts period. So so I'm not sure if she was satisfied with my answer that I was a cultural geographer and collective puzzle solver, but she seemed a little bit miffed with me. And part of what I wanted to say tonight too is I have remembering Mr. Curtis. And Mr. Curtis, he passed in the summer of 2020, evidently. And he was a teacher at South Mecklenburg High School, where I attended in Charlotte, North Carolina, suburban Charlotte. And it was a well-regarded public school. May still be. I haven't kept up, but and he taught AP World History. Now, I was just talking with a former neighbor today, and we were talking. She works at a school, and we were talking about catching up on things, including, fortunately, we're sort of on the similar page as a lot of the stuff I talk about. We hadn't seen each other in a long time, but she works in a school, so I wanted to make sure she understood what I was talking about more recently about channels and children and the technology. And thinking about the teaming and the story and social structures and how those relate to group energetic systems among groups, and how that could be leveraged in this new, in my opinion, maybe it's actually not new, but if what we're looking at is using biology to do some of these interdimensional information processing programs, looking back at school is the social conditioning structure. So on the one hand, as someone who used to identify more as left, like, you could understand it as like the goal of schools is to prepare children to be productive members of society, which means contributing to the economy that has been planned out largely, 50 to 100 years ahead of time, and to train them to accept that and to be in that game. And of course, when you're a kid, you don't know that, because it's like you're a fish in water. You don't even, what is the water? Most of us. There are some people who, even as children, know that they can see the water and realize like what's going on, and maybe they feel like they don't actually belong with the other fish in the oh gosh, what do you call groups of fish? I can't remember. You guys can help me out with that. So with Mr. Curtis, like, it was AP World History, and I don't know how things are with schools these days, but when I was in high school back in the 80s, there were tracks, right? So there was the regular classes, and then there was the advanced classes, and then there were the AP classes, and it may still be this way. At the time, you just accept that is the culture, that is the system. You don't, like, for me, people who aren't bucking the system don't see it as a game. They just see it for what it is, and you find your space in the system, and then you work towards the goal that's set for you, because you're young and you don't know any different. And at the time there was sort of a cohort of us. Now, I will say, looking back, I realized now that the goal of people who play the game at a certain perceived higher level, right? Maybe on the societal game board, it's perceived as the higher level, are managed within the game to feel somewhat superior to the people at the other levels of the game, and sort of to reaffirm the identity of that group. And then the idea that if you are a special group, like you need to conform to the norms of that group to maintain your position, which is above. But so the people in the above positions are generally, they evolve around conformity, right? Because you understand the game and you want to play the game. And that was the case for me, and the friends that I had, and so we wanted to play the game, and we were in the AP set, and we didn't really realize that, oh, maybe the goal is to have the people at that level run the ant computer, because they know that they're up there, and maybe they get special privileges or something like that, or perceived status, and they don't want to lose that. So the people who are managing the ant computer won't rebel against it because they're invested in the system. And I think that happens at all levels of society. And so again, and that comes to you from a very early age. And you don't even, most people don't even think about it. And I didn't think about it. I really haven't been rebellious until my much later years. Looking back, I realized that, like, for us, like, this stereotype was like the kids hanging out smoking around the flagpole, right? Like, oh, we're those people, and then those are those people. Looking back, what now I realize, especially as I've been looking into acetylcholine receptors and nicotine, is that those people were probably the ones who knew the game, didn't like the game, and had other interesting ideas outside of the game beyond what they were teaching you for an AP test. And in the course of my journey over time, I've realized that the people who chose non-traditional paths actually often had more complex, interesting takes on what was happening in the world around us than those of us who were trained in certain stories. And I think that's on purpose, right? So that the people who get ahead are the people who accommodate themselves to the stories, and the other people aren't. But I think maybe the system itself has a way of keeping very close tabs on the people who are on the other team, because in some ways their behaviors are probably much more interesting. So I just want to lay that out there. Like, I have a much, evolving perspective on that. And I did well in school. So my advocacy came in through education because I believed in public education. I mean, I don't really know what I believe anymore. Like, I'm not sure what kind of education is best, because I think the ant computer is coming after all the subsets, whether it's public or private or religious or charters or all of those, homeschool, unschool, like they're coming for all of it. But education being about slotting you into society in the ant computer. And so we're meant to feel superior. And I would say, like, in some ways, my experience in that was like, I think where things are with the resistance, like, they want you to believe that you're above or better than others so that you can have your consciousness managed in a certain way. So I'm just going to sort of say it's sort of a funny thing. So this class, our teacher, Mr. Curtis, he was a very imposing gentleman. He was sort of barrel-chested and had a little bit of an underbite, like a pointy tooth, and we were all a little bit afraid of Mr. Curtis, but we knew he was super smart, and we wanted him to acknowledge that we were also, like, that we had potential, right? Like, he had very high standards, and even in high school, we would have these blue book tests. I don't think they probably even have blue books anymore, but they were like the little tiny booklets, and you would have to write everything by hand, like these long form answers. And we're like, oh, this is like college. They have blue books, right? And we also felt a little bit, proud of ourselves that we did blue books. But we were also a little bit scared of it. Like, not that he was a mean man, but he had this way about him, high expectations. And in the course of the year, towards the second semester, you had this capstone research paper that you had to do. And everyone had to give a topic. And, I'm sure that this is sort of standard course these days, or maybe not, I don't know. But, the bibliography and the outlines, and, the whole process went on for several months. And you had this topic, and mine was Honoré Daumier, the French caricaturist. And as part of that, a friend and I, because we'd really just got our driver's licenses, and I drove all the way out to Davidson to go to the Davidson College Library to do official research. And I felt, again, like, very proud of myself. Now, Mr. Curtis didn't say you had to go to a college library and do that, but, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like we had a culture within this group, which was sort of tapped to be the group that would go to the schools and then run the Ant computer. But it was sort of this like goal that we wanted to, not just for the grade per se, although ultimately we were a little bit silly, and this is like when we talk about artifacts, somehow, I don't know whose idea it was, we had gotten in the idea that we would get t-shirts printed with the topic of our paper and our grade on the back, and then we would wear them, which is the most ridiculous thing ever. Like, I'm super embarrassed to even say that we would do that at the time, and I don't remember exactly what grade I got. I'm assuming most people got pretty high grades, but it was a way of like cementing our participation in this process of becoming more skilled researchers. And so I'm sort of sharing this within the context of these artifacts, because for me, this t-shirt was an artifact. And I even think about this now in terms of the data dashboards. And I've been thinking a lot about physics and the wave collapse and particles and waves and data dashboards and how they may interact and impact finance with John Wheeler's participatory universe and all of this. But like way back in the 80s, we were already doing like early like data artifact things that identified us, right? Like not exactly a digital twin, but we were participating in that culture unthinkingly, right? I mean, no one told us to do that. I think somebody just came up with this funny idea, but we had this group, but we were, at the time, it wasn't like, yeah, we wanted to get good grades, and some people would get scholarships and go to fancy schools, but for the most part, we kind of wanted to do it for the process as opposed to just the grade. And it wasn't the grade inflation and like, oh, if you don't get all 99s, you're going to collapse and, you know, and end up doing self-harm or something because you felt inadequate. And it wasn't that. Like, we were in a place that as a community of peers, we wanted to do high-level work. And we actually wanted Mr. Curtis to be proud of us for doing that, for stepping up into that space. And so I think, you know, anyone's journey starts at one step at a time. You know, and I can't say that that was the first step, but I think one of my early steps in that process of becoming a cultural geographer was being, you know, a 17-year-old in Mr. Curtis's class and with peers, you know, its own like socio-technical system, right? And then navigating that challenge. And he was fair. He was not a teacher that was trying to do a gotcha, but he had very high standards. So I think when I'm doing the work that I'm doing, what in the back of my mind, and maybe I haven't even really thought about it till tonight, but my desire in my heart is that we will find the others, right, who would be like the equivalent of my peers in, you know, 1987 South Mech World History AP, where we are actively all engaged at a high level to participate in something that is important. You know, and I can't say that high school papers are like really that important, but we felt like at the time that it was important to us, to our evolution, our learning process, our educational trajectory to participate and then to strive, you know, for this thing. And so like that, within that context, that's what I keep hoping, but it's a steep learning curve. So to get there, to get in the door so that we can all sort of do this together, it's not easy. So I acknowledge it's not easy, and I may be hoping for something that will never happen and is unrealistic, and I acknowledge that. The other thing I will say is that in one of the comments, someone asked me, so, you know, just question here. I'm wondering, what are you doing on YouTube, and like, what do you see as your place in the Ant computer? Like, what is your role? Because you're not getting banned or what have you. And so my answer to that was, okay, well, I'm here because I don't think there's any place that's outside the game. I think they tell you a story to think you're outside the game to move you around the game board, which was in this case to move people over to the attention token economy and these tokenized blockchain systems. And so while, yes, Google, Alphabet, YouTube is a huge problem. The attention economy is just a different flavor of problem. And this is where I started. And so if people are curious and they want to go back to my first videos, maybe in 2016, of me at the city council meetings, they can see, like, I'm not a fabricated individual. I have my own, and I have my own process, right? Like with every 6 months, I sort of revise and refine and create like a newer, more complex, comprehensive understanding of what it is. And some things drop away and then some things become deeper. And so you can see that process. And I try to acknowledge that because we shouldn't be stuck in one place. Because if we continue to get information, we should continue to adjust ourselves. And so that's why I said I was still on YouTube. And then as far as like what I was trying to do, I said, I don't think there's an outside, there's an outside of this thing. But my goal is to, I think, maybe emit a clear signal around like authentic, curious inquiry as to what this is. And group participation in that inquiry. And it is all signals, right? And I think it all comes from the heart. And so that's how I feel about this space, what I'm doing. And I don't think I'm banned because I'm not talking about the things that are going to drive people around the game board, right? They ban things to create a reaction to move people around the game board, and not enough people are paying attention to me. They're probably watching me, right? They're probably like, there's some interesting stuff, weird stuff going on over there, and we should maybe watch her and watch who's watching her. And I'm not saying that's not happening. I'm not trying to do that, but realistically, that's probably what's happening. It's like, now I've turned into I don't actively smoke, but the people smoking at the flagpole. So I'm out of the not ruling class, but the people who are supposed to run the Ant computer. And I'm like, okay, I see that game. I'm a level above, and I'm somewhere else. And it's kind of like setting up. I talked before about you don't have to go into the room and pick up a paddle. Maybe you can just stay in the hallway. And I think this YouTube channel is maybe staying in the hallway. And so there may be some attention, but in that way, maybe they don't shut me down because they're curious what I'm going to do next or what we're all going to do next. I don't know. So honestly, maybe that's what it is. And, but I did say that this is a place for serious inquiry. Like it's an independent study with shared materials, a study group. And actually someone was in contact with me and is interested in setting up a study group. And so I think starting with focusing on the world sensorium. So I will put a link to this person's email in the pin section. And if you are interested in doing that, please do. It would be great to have some more participants and build that community. And I thank you for the person who offered to do that facilitation. That's awesome. I love it. And yeah, please do join into that. But independent study, right? And so in that, beyond the Mr. Curtis, who again, like, bless his heart, like when the lady in the emerald dress says, like, what do you do and why are you that? One of the steps along the way was the class with Mr. Curtis. And his high expectations that we could do it. And I think in the maybe everyone gets a trophy milieu, or how dare you tell me what to do or what to be or whatever, having a community that has high expectations on things that are important, like impact finance, would be great. And I just was in touch with someone who's in Maine, which is really, Maine is the domestic rollout, has been the domestic test bed for the One Laptop, One Child program. And now the EduCare Impact Finance and Pre-K and Health and Human Services is coming in with those data dashboards. And so remember, EduCare was also doing the surveillance play tables. So it matters, right? Like the thing that hurts my heart sometimes is the idea that things I talked about 4 or 5 years ago that were really important just have gotten buried and no one else has kept the flame going. But it's not that those things aren't important anymore. They're actually happening. And in some ways, I think they're happening in a far more consistent way than many of the sort of fear porn aspects of the resistance in those early years. And it's a shame that we haven't surfaced those in a more consistent way. But I can't do all the things, right? Like I can't do all of those things. So anyway, so so the independent study part. If you follow my work, and maybe you're new to this video, I have a blog. It's called wrenchinthegears.com. Now, my wrenchinthegears.com is actually based on a documentary film about David Noble. And David Noble he was sort of a left-leaning, maybe even Marxist, I'm not sure, but historian, but he was very interested in the role of labor and technology. But he also included some things about women, and he included some things about religion, and he was a super interesting guy. And he was always, he went to a bunch of different schools. He was at MIT, he had a big case. He was from a Jewish family, and he was sort of opposed to Zionism, and so he was constantly having run-ins over that, and he got pushed out of MIT over tenure, but I think he actually won his case. And then he was at Drexel for a while here in Philadelphia, and they pushed him out, and then he created a whole exhibit at the Smithsonian on industrialization and automation of labor and the implication for labor, and some Smithsonian squelched it and never put the exhibit on. And then I'm trying to remember where he ended up, maybe York University in Canada. But he was very good, very clever at doing like open records requests and legal. And he was always on the case of the state of California and the University of California system around intellectual property rights in higher education and where things were going in ed tech, right? Pre-Canvas, pre-Instructure, all of that. And he had dialed in the number of the University of California system. And that's quite a powerful, powerful system. And then sadly, he ended up going into the hospital in his like mid-60s and then not coming out. So he died prematurely, which was very sad and a great loss. But he had a twin brother, Doug, and I didn't know, more people know David Noble than Douglas Noble, but I knew Doug because I had found this book called The Classroom Arsenal. And he had been involved in like defense, the Air Force. I'm trying to remember, it's outside of Boston, the big Air Force base. And in radar and the Cold War stuff, and then left that and became, a founder, administrator of a private school, I think actually in Rochester area. And then he ended up being involved in a lot of sort of anti-war, anti-drone work. And so he wrote this book about Classroom Arsenal that was linking the military human-machine interface with the Air Force to the educational technology system. And I found that book, and that was foundational for me early on to understand ed tech as a military project. But at the time, I was still thinking about human-computer interface more with devices than frequency, right? I wasn't understanding that some of the main weapons of the military are psychological and behavioral and happening at a mass scale and happening domestically. So I would just say we still don't understand the weapons, really. And I don't think at the time that Douglas really understood the weapons either. But he did. We connected, and he incorporated some material that I had on XAPI technologies into the reedition. I think Routledge republished his book within the last 5 years or so. And very interesting family. And the thing about his brother David, who died, is that he never graded his students. Now, he was at high-level universities, right? He was at MIT, but he didn't actually do grades. And it was somewhat controversial. And, at the time, some of the people would say, well, some of us do the work. Why should we not get the higher grade than the people who don't do the work? And his position was that if you do the work, you get the education, right? If you don't do the work, you don't get the education. And that's just how it is. You actually have to do the work. And it's the knowledge and the path towards that knowledge that matters, not the grade. And so this goes back to how silly we were thinking that it was about the grade and how wrong that was, but we were immature and we didn't know better, right? So that's sort of an embarrassing incident for me, but it's a sort of, in retrospect, it's actually a really useful touch point to realize at the time I did not understand the game. And that's what I keep trying to say to the resistance is I don't think you understand the game. I don't understand the whole game. But on this layer of the game, I've gotten some distance above it, enough to see the landscape and the landscape is not what most people understand it to be. The systems in play are not what most people understand it to be. And so I know enough to know that I don't know, but that we have to get some distance on it. And we have to understand the terrain we're operating in, or otherwise we're literally just going to be moved around on the game board by the Michael Matthiases of the world with this Aristotelian AI drama stuff and conductor and XAPI technology and spatial computing, because we won't even understand that. And to me, I do feel like we stand a fighting chance, because a lot of this stuff is based on, again, particle wave collapse and frequencies. And I think our biology has the capacity to interface with the field to have more clarity than we are using. I think we can cultivate that. I think there are ancient knowledges that cultivate that. And I think to a certain extent, I think our heart field is very, very powerful as a neutralizing force to some of these militarized technologies. And so I think that there's possibilities there that we need to consider, but that's only if we actually understand what the tactics that are being used to against us, and against us meaning not to kill us, not to zap us with a directed energy weapon, but to steer us stigmergically through digital pheromones and artifacts, manipulating artifacts and manipulating story and narrative to get us moved on the game board where they want us to be moved. So I invite you to think about those. Those are some personal stories from me about like this situating in this space of this recent excursion to the Mercer Museum, right? And then afterwards we went to make a lovely heart intention in this labyrinth, local labyrinth that they had. And yeah, what are these artifacts made by hand, and what energies and what stories are attached to them? Because I think Henry Mercer understood the power of artifacts and the power of story. And I think all of these museums, like, again, you look at who the funders are of the museums and the elite, that they understand the power of these artifacts, especially artifacts made with human direct contact of hand and energy. Like, that interface is super important. Okay, so now we understand artifacts a little bit better. Now we understand maybe a spirit of collective engagement at a high level, because we want people to acknowledge our high level of participation, not for the grade, but because for the satisfaction of doing and knowing that we've stretched ourselves. And that ultimately it's a choice, at least here in this corner of the interwebs. It is an independent study. But within the independent study, hopefully it's being done not in a hive mind community, but in a feeling of reciprocity that we can do that. Now, granted, I will say again, we're on YouTube, we're on Alphabet. I'm not trying to obscure anybody and trick anybody into giving answers or clues into a puzzle that they think somehow I'm being tricky in doing that. I acknowledge that this is, I don't know how to do it outside the system. And maybe I'll get to Arkansas and I'll find a community and we'll just not do it anymore here, and we'll just do it in person. And certainly there's lots of frequency and water and crystals there. So maybe we just don't even need this goofy interface. And you guys can be on your own and do your own thing. But for now, this is here. And if you want to do this way, this is the only way I know how to do it right now. Okay, so I guess I will close my story with that, and then just take a moment to talk about some of these artifacts. So this is and actually the person who asked the question, like, what are you in this space, their handle was something about octopus, right? And I'm like, do you mind me asking, like, where you got your handle? Because this octopus idea is central to distributed cognition. I've talked about that. Again, it was in the Tchaikovsky books, the second one, that there's the goal setting from the top of the octopus brain, and then the local conditions are in the tentacles, and that would be the sensorium, right? The Oliver Reiser world sensorium, that we are individually as agents doing the sensing for the larger system. And I was just kind of curious, but I don't think the person ever got around to answering me on that. But I thought that was an interesting observation that was being asked by somebody who went by octopus some number or something. 5858. I think it was 5858. Maybe there were fives in there. Anyway, so if we think about the fact that we are agents We are in this Maya, possibly grand illusion, game board that has always probably been a game board, right? Culture is a game board. This is what I was talking about with my neighbor in the school, who works at the school. Like, at what line, everyone's always like, it's control, it's control, it's control. And I'm like, okay, well, ultimately culture is control and story is control. And granted, there are certainly egregious uses of control that are more, but like, at what point does culture become oppressive as it is? Like, even without all of the censors and the surveillance and all of the other stuff, like, is culture in and of itself oppressive or not? And, it's worth talking about. I mean, I guess people might feel differently about different aspects of culture, but I think that's a useful question. So, so distributed cognition, that's this part of the map. That mind is extended across various agents in space and time, and we offload processing onto the environment, onto artifacts. And then working a little bit further down here, this is from Michael Levin, this idea of a self is combined units under one goal. And so he's talking about these different light cones, which is interesting. I believe he specifically says light cones, because later on I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Suhrawardi and illumination, school of illumination, and light. And again, Michaela Uluru is always talking about working with luminaries to make the future, and it's these light cones. So Michael Levin and his crew are very interested in grouping different kinds of minds and grouping various goals under one heading. And so those are Melanie Swan's blockchain cloud minds, right? Like blockchain your way into a cloud mind. So they're working on to creating group minds, and I've talked about that before, including like non-human minds and engineered minds. And that's a little bit comes up in the book Babel 17, this idea of a group mind. And actually in their spaceship crew, they have different members that work together as sensing objects, as sensors, really. So there's like the eyes, nose, ears, and nose people. Each one does one of those things. There's discorporate, which are participants in the spaceship that don't have a body. And the captain is neurodivergent. And then there's something about triples, this group, and it's like a menage a trois, like there is a sexual energy to it, but I think that the triple may be also related to like Pythagoreanism, like the triangulation, and maybe the Kundalini energy within a triangle that's important. But the idea that these group minds could be some of the portals for problem solving, for the computation, and maybe these minds would be held in a vessel like the Sophia, the robot, and that vessel itself could be considered semi-alchemical, right? These robots with soft robotic features with electronic muscles that are like the fascia. And so these group minds, I think, if you start to consider it this way, the teams that happened, right, all during the lockdowns, the creation of like work teams, but before that, online chat rooms, multiplayer role-playing games, those are group minds, like the teaming, the battles, asynchronous learning environments, discussion boards. All of these could be sort of considered on like group minds towards different problem solving. And again, that's something that Levin is really interested in. And so and part of the group mind is that you would outsource things to these artifacts. And so I'm just going to take a minute and read a little bit of this. Let me see if I can adjust this. Yeah, okay. So this is from Distributed Cognition. Okay, so Hutchins argues that mental representations, which classical cognitive science held are within the individual brain, are actually distributed into sociocultural systems. And so think about that in the context of the Mercer Museum, that constitute tools to think about and perceive the world. So we outsource our brain into the environment, right? And like the phones are kind of really our extended brain, right? But before phones, it was books, right? And paintings and architecture and even songs. Like we solidify our understandings in things that are external to us and often shared. And so these artifacts are important that way. That cognition not only involves the brain, but these artifacts, and that teams made up of several people and cultural systems interpret reality through the artifacts. Okay, so the artifacts are used to determine our reality. It's an extended cognition. And then, so this decog is this distributed cognition, and it takes a computational perspective towards goal activity systems. And so again, that cybernetics is all goal-oriented behavior. And then the data dashboards are progress towards goal, right? Key performance indicators. That's part of the distributed cognition, is the key performance indicator mindset, which is management theory. And I really do think that a lot of the organizational theory and corporate consulting management theory of the post-World War II on is really about creating these corporations as superorganisms, as the model superorganisms. Okay, so then it talks about offloading your cognition into the environment. Now think about that in terms of augmented reality and stigmergy and digital artifacts and NFTs, and the way you can nest information with an NFT and encrypt it so different people are accessing different degrees of information about the object. Like, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. It says, according to Zhang and Norman in 1994, the distributed cognition approach has three components: embodiment of information embedded in representations of interaction. So I think, again, thinking about that in terms of NFTs and smart contracts and ledgers. The coordination of inaction among agents. And so coordinating is really central to Web3. And ecological contributions to a cognitive ecosystem. So group mind, and group mind that extends into artifacts that are shared across space and time. And so that is really important to me in thinking about how we navigated the Mercer Museum. And that the self can be these combined units. So like in terms of the self in Babel 17, which was this sort of space fantasy, the self was the team that was navigating the spaceship. It was a distributed cognition of different participants, all of whom were doing their own thing. So within this, let's see. So the coordination strategy with the artifacts or the NFTs, that's what the Web3 is about. We're inscribing information onto the environment. And so again, think about ledger as an inscription, a permanent inscription, and that those are stimuli that are almost like pheromones, like digital pheromones and digital clues that are left. So like when you've got the ant computer and the ant is leaving a trail, and the ant colony understands where to find the food because the pheromone dissipates over time. And so the thickest laying down of the pheromones, the biggest, most robust trail, is where more of the food is at present. And it's a directional system. And it exists even if there are no other ants around in that moment, that the pheromone is still strong. Even if there's no other ants, when an ant shows up, that ant will understand through the laying down of this information field that this is the place to go, right? They're being shown even though there's not other agents there. It's like a sign pointing, right? It's a symbol. And these symbols can be like chemosensory in the case of pheromones. But I think we're looking increasingly at pheromones, these digital pheromones, and what these will look like. And they sometimes talk about using these for swarm robotics. But I think it's really about group mind. And some of those may be robots and some of them may be people. So that is indirect communication. So you read the artifacts, and the artifacts mediate thought. And and then the artifacts transform knowledge. And so think about it as we're moving to Instagram, as we're moving to, what is it? Is it Pinterest? These things we're moving more toward an image-based, an emotion-laden image-based, TikTok, these short videos, emotion-embedded imagery that is supplanting spoken and written language as the pheromonal equivalent, right? And these short things, if you think about our communication from like big novels to getting to be tweets or smaller things, like tiny things that our mind is becoming atomized because they need constant signaling to show where the collective swarm behavior is. if they wait till someone reads a whole novel over the course of like a month and then get a reaction, a signal, that's not fast enough. What the system is after, in my opinion, is lots of immediate reactivity to show the flow of the group mind to a certain direction. And in that flow, they will find the pattern that is part of the computational resource that is sought. And okay, so situated knowledge, or situated cognition, situated action. So situated action is on learner responsiveness to their environment and in the flux of activity. And so this is used in all sorts of things about multi-agent systems, complex systems, robotics, and all of that is like how the action is situated itself. And then just looking at situated cognition, it says, situated cognition is a theory that posits that knowing is inseparable from doing, arguing all knowledge is situated in activity bound to social, cultural, and physical contexts. So think about that as we're doing augmented reality, like that everything is being sensed all the time and kept on a permanent ledger, that is embedding, right? That is, and it's dynamic embedding, right? So it's almost like taking photos like super fast, and it will like across space-time capture sort of an animation of an artifact and its importance, or uplift or downlift of importance across time and space. And that its importance is determined socially because these are socio-technical systems. So hence the need for social media, like the social media is part of the signaling system. And then it goes on to say situativity theorists suggest a model of knowledge and learning that requires thinking on the fly rather than storage and retrieval of conceptual knowledge. Cognition cannot be separated from context. Knowing exists in situ, inseparable from context, activity, people, culture, and language. Learning is seen in terms of an individual's increasingly effective performance across situations rather than in terms of an accumulation of knowledge, since what is known is co-determined by the agent and the context. So in that, everything is in what? Is in a state of flow, right? There is no one hard reality. We're going to live in a pluriverse that's always in motion and changing dynamically based on the input signals of the group. And that's why we have to move to the multiverse, because it is more fluid than material reality at this point. So we get lots of people doing lots of signaling in a constantly dynamically changing environment where the reaction is embedded in the context, which is exactly what social media does, and metadata and hashtags, and they create a digital environment for that flow system to find the patterns. And then just moving on, it's talking a little bit about the history. Lucy Suchman's work on situated action at Xerox Labs popularized the idea that an actor's understanding of how to perform work results from reflecting on interactions with the social and the material situation in which he or she acts. More recent perspectives of situated cognition have focused on and draw from the concept of identity formation as people negotiate meaning through interactions within communities of practice. And so I think for me, when I hear that, like the idea of that your participation has to be situated against your material reality and your social reality. Like it is embedded. You're not just off on your own, it's embedded in that. And that is part of your identity, that your identity is in response to those around you and how you react to those around you. So, increasingly, I'm trying to sort of figure out to what extent I'm going to still do this later. And, even being off the feed, I feel disconnected from the social interactions. Like I can't really position myself against other teams or similar complementary groups of people because I literally don't even know about them. I don't know of them. So I'm increasingly sort of an isolated agent. So I don't know exactly what that means for me. But yeah, so communication through artifacts, distributed cognition, knowledge management. So these architectures are artifacts are carrying knowledge. And so, we think about, Jeremy Pitt talking about knowledge management, like the right information to the right people at the right time. In distributed cognition, it says behavior results from the interaction between external and internal representational structures. External representations are environmental structures, which when they are good have the power to organize information so that it is in the right place at the right time. And it encodes information in a form that is more explicit and easier to use. And so I think that's part of like Eugene Garfield's bibliometry, is organizing the information field and having it available at a certain time. Like, I think the people who imagine that Web3 tokens are going to solve all of our coordination problems and make knowledge available promptly, where it's needed, when it's needed, I think that's a bit of a pipe dream, honestly, because ultimately the superorganism doesn't want certain people to have knowledge when it's inappropriate for the goal-oriented behavior. If a subset of groups over here is not interested in the goal and thinks the goal is not good, they're going to be excluded from the information pipeline that might advantage them in slowing down the progress towards that system, right? And so we have, encryption within these ledgers. Not everything is open to everyone. And you can imagine that you would be able to unlock different levels of access, which totally already exist in the token economy and the online patron model, that depending on who you are in the system and how much skin you have in the game and how much money you've put up, you're going to have access to more knowledge than other people. And then that's going to be played into the overall social computation system. Okay, so collective problems, situated action. Yeah, the indirect communications, those are sort of the pheromones. There's something called a path-dependent process, which is interesting in terms of the choice architecture. A path dependence in social sciences refers to past events or decisions constraining later events. And so if you think about like choice architecture, because you made this choice, in the future, some choices that had been open to you will be closed. And that's, I think, part of the logic gate system. And so you choose a path, and then depending on the next choice, gates further down the line open or close. And and this has been challenging for me because, again, I'm facing a lot of choices to make, and optimally, you'd like to have as much information as possible and hope to make an informed choice, and then you hope your choice is good. But ultimately, what is good? Because something that happens to you immediately that seems bad could later be okay or better, put you in a position that you actually needed to be in. But it's all the paths are opening and closing depending on what you're choosing when. And so I think that the protocol layer is part of guiding that pathway, and then also not just guiding it, because this is what I'm saying, in the complex emergent systems, your choice is what's interesting. They don't necessarily want you to stay on one path and walk it directly and efficiently and make you into a puppet. They want to create the environment and then see how you choose to walk the path, because that's the interesting part. But then actually log everything in the ledger so that they can use that for pattern recognition. Okay, yeah, so some choices that you make. And then it says, it says, path dependence. In common usage, the phrase can imply two types of claims. The first is a broad concept that, quote, history matters, often articulated to challenge explanations that pay insufficient attention to historical factors. This claim can be formulated simply as the future development of an economic system is affected by the path it is traced in the past, right? History matters. And so I'm a cultural geographer. I like history. I think history is important. The second is a more specific claim that past events or decisions affect future events in significant or disproportionate ways. And so this is part of the complexity theory, is that I think they're looking for patterns in social systems where small incremental changes result in significant changes. And I would assume generally significant changes that advance towards a goal. And then that's something, if you're keeping a permanent ledger of all of the choices that everyone's making all of the time, and then you're connecting it to AI, because again, AI doesn't have a soul. They need us, which is an embodied soul with the liquid computing and access to the field, to be making the choices and refining the choices and finding the pathways. But then all of that data gets aggregated together and networked, I think, again, through the frequency and self-assembling nanotechnology at scale into the AI, and then the AI is finding the pattern. And to me, that's we're the sensors for the machine processing. But again, to what end, I'm not sure, because I don't know exactly how that works. Let's see, anything else? Yeah, just the idea of digital artifacts, right? And the knowledge management and how much is being held, that, that digital artifacts have provenance, these badges have metadata. And to me, these are all pictographic, and looking at Web3 creating new symbolic types of language over time, like new types of communication methods. And sort of within this, I have a section here about artifacts. And I think Sean, I'm pretty sure Sean was the one who showed this to me. It's a Neri Oxman, like our favorite person. This is when she was with the MIT Mediated Matter Data Visualization Project. And so she was using data sets and machine learning to create these sort of fluid representations of digital systems. And she, if you can see these mediated matter, including like glass, because there's sort of a phase shift with glass, data-driven material modeling. And so I've talked a little bit about it before. I don't think we have the orb. I don't think the orb is in here. Sean had showed me this. Oh, no, maybe this is, I'm putting my face. So a computational environment for data-driven material modeling. So it is for people who are listening and not watching, it's a three-dimensional, it looks like a glass paperweight, right? But in it is sort of a webby system of loops and threads and nodes that look somewhat like neurons or like web-like systems that are a physical representation, a three-dimensional representation of a data set. And that's a communication artifact. And I feel like that's, when I talk about synesthesia, neurodiversity, different kinds of languaging, dance, fascia being used to communicate information from the field. Like, I feel like these orbs from Neri Oxman are an example of what that's going to look like. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about with the artifacts in this. Yeah, embodied cognition, you need the body, right? You don't get rid of the body is important. The Sophia, the DAO, they're interested in creating these artificial bodies, electronic artificial bodies, to hold the group mind, because they need the mind. And the Santa Fe Institute using agents with feedback loops. So maybe I'll just read this from Santa Fe Institute. We are building a theoretical framework to guide the creation of artificial agents that adjust their neural networks or brains to feedback from their bodies and surroundings, in essence, to learn how to navigate, right? So these are the feedback loops. This is why having a body is important. Humans are not born pre-programmed with a set of intelligent behaviors, such as carrying on a conversation or moving through a crowded room. Rather, we build this kind of intelligence by adjusting to constant feedback from our bodies and our surroundings. And so I would say this, in many respects, is why early childhood development in psychology is super important for artificial intelligence, because they're looking at how does it go from a zygote to a functioning human being? How does that developmental process happen? How does the embryology happen? And then how does the cognition happen? And then how does the socially embedded behaviors happen? And so looking at children and studying children is super important to all of this. In the field of embodied intelligence, there's a notion that places emphasis on the role of an agent's body in generating behavior. The Santa Fe Institute project aims to build a framework of embodied artificial AI that treats the brain-body environment as inseparable cognitive elements. So again, the brain, the body, and the environment. So everything needs to be sensed. The entire environment, and this is not just the natural environment, but the entire setting around the individual has to be part of the spatial computing. And then he's talking about training the agents, that they don't tell them everything, but they tell them to seek out a variety of experiences and instruct them to maximize their predictive information. So you go out and look and find. And so again, I just wonder, they're talking about artificial agents, but I almost feel like we are agents of the field already, going out and having experiences and making sense of them and telling stories and bringing the information back. they're talking about it with AI. And clearly we're not AI, but I think this has already been going on in a natural state for a long time. It says the Santa Fe Institute is known for its pioneering work in information theory and self-organization is an ideal setting to conduct our research. So the self-organizing, and that's why the environment is important. Okay, so now I'm going to just skip over to here. This is my Artem map. I do have this giant map. You can kind of see how big it is, really big. They're all usually really big. This bit over here, so all these yellow dots, a lot of them have to do with the Netflix series Maniac, which Steffers turned me on to. It's from 2018. It's only, I think, 10 episodes. They're not super long. And they want you to think that it's about psychology or psychiatry or schizophrenia, but really Maniac is the Nick Metropolis computer at Los Alamos, and it's about applied mathematics and sociotechnical systems and interdimensional interfaces and relationships in those those communications across space-time. So in that, the whole thing is highly stenographic. So, if we imagine that Emanuel Swedenborg is an engineer all his life until his 50s, and then he has a mystical experience, and then he starts going through the Bible and saying, hey, every single of these verses, I'm going to write a whole page of what this really means. And I'm not equating myself like Maniac to the Bible or me to Swedenborg, but the steganography is so intense in this series that, I started and then I just hit some bumps along the road, so I haven't had a chance to interpret all of Maniac, but there's it's almost like you could pause every single 10 seconds and take a screenshot and point out all of the things. It's almost too complex to even imagine how any one person or team of writers or I don't know if the writers actually lay out all of the artifacts in the scenes, but this series itself is a communications artifact, and then all of the objects in the series are also communications artifacts that are nested within one another to tell this larger story. So in the series, one of the main characters, there's a male and female lead, and the male lead in the past has had a schizophrenic blip. He ends up, due to sort of precarious circumstances, trying to earn money in a pharmaceutical trial. It's called the ULP, and we were guessing about if it meant what the ULP stood for. At the time, Steffers and I were really interested in the Wheeler's participatory universe, so I'm like, maybe it's the universe live and participatory, because it seemed to be that in the show. And in the show, they talk about the guy keeps seeing popcorn popping, and so it starts out his in one of the opening scenes in the first episode. There's this guy. They're on the island of Extra Liberty. And this is a man who is not actually his brother, but he's imagining him as his brother. And so he's sort of having a hallucination. But it turns out later in the series that actually this man is a twin of his real brother who's sort of evil, and he never made it out of the womb. So there's an energetic imprint of this brother that exists, but just not in material reality. And so the energy from the field of this brother keeps coming back to speak to his other brother about finding things in the pattern and saving the world. And so he's sitting on the bench, Owen, and he's tossing unpopped popcorn to the pigeons, which there's a genetic element to the pigeons featured there. And then the popcorn, it says here the popcorn is popping. He's sort of shocked. He drops the popcorn on the ground unpopped, and then it pops, right? And this is something that recurs over time. There's later on, he's on the phone with the biopharmaceutical folks, and he hasn't really even meaningfully signed up, but they're really after him to be part of this trial, and they call him a hero candidate. And again, behind this is this imprinting, this light-based imprinting, which is the optogenetics, red and blue, and the O, it's flashing. There's another one that's a different O, but the one, right, the monad. And so the woman on the line says, calls him a hero candidate for this pharmaceutical trial. And he's saying, well, what does a hero candidate do? And we're talking here about the heroic archetype. And the woman says exactly the things that they were born to do. which is an archetypal field. This is like an astrological, your soul journey. What you were born to do, you do what you were born to do. And she says, in your case, helping us treat maladies ranging from sluggishness and depression. And then here's the other O, you've got Jolly Ranchers. But again, the monad, the one behind his head, to IBS, to popcorn problems. She says popcorn problems. And he's like, popcorn problems? Because like, that's not even a thing. Only he does have a popcorn problem. He's like, popcorn problems. And then she speaks up and she's like, prostate problems. Yes. So it's sort of a distraction that, it's not popcorn, it's prostate. And then later on in one of the later episodes, he's playing a different character where he's supposedly not human, that he has a human body, but he's an alien. And she goes to extract something from his body with this tool, and she finds it. It's in his knee. And so she's pulling it out, and when it pulls out, it's actually, it's a little bead, which actually looks like mercury, like a mercury bead, which is commerce and communication and transitions. And then it pops and it turns into popcorn, right? So there's this popcorn element to it. Now at the time, because this was all about the hero's journey, he's the hero figure, I thought maybe the popcorn was related to Barbara McClintock. Because Barbara McClintock was a scientist at Cold Spring Harbor Labs, again, out on Long Island, and she was known for breeding corn and this idea of jumping genes in corn, like Indian corn, and it had to do later on with epigenetics, which we know is about Lamarck, and like pulling your information out of the field and reusing it. And so it turns out that Barbara McClintock was the person, so here's like some about her epigenetics. She was the person who actually introduced, let me see, do I have this? Yeah, so she introduced George Lucas to Joseph Campbell. So the Star Wars guy to the hero's journey guy. And it's just very weird to imagine, like, what is a Cold Spring Harbor biochemist working on jumping genes? How is that the bridge that's made between Joseph Campbell and George Lucas? But that's the thing. So I was thinking jumping genes, and actually the pigeons are part of this jumping gene problem, these transposable elements. Transposable elements are also related to schizophrenia, which is part of the story there. And then it's also related to pigeons, these transposons. So the fact that he's feeding corn to pigeons and it's popping and they're kernels is something. But then kernel is also the core protected thing in an operating system. So later on, I'll talk a little bit about, not tonight, but later, about quantum psychiatry and the idea of quantum biology and quantum chemistry fitting into new theories of psychiatry linked to the field, and how your biology holds you in one reality, and when it starts to break down, then you have hallucinations and the superpositions of reality start bleeding through, and that's kind of the implication a little bit in the story. But your kernel is your overall operating system in a computer system. It says, a kernel is a computer program at the core of the operating system, and it has complete control over everything. It migrates things, it does hardware upgrades, it's very protected from access, and it's kept safe. So to me, that's sort of like the blood-brain barrier and the blood barrier on the eye, on the retina and the optic nerve, is that the kernel is to protect the operating system to keep you in this reality. And then at some point, my friend that I have in Utah directed me to the company Kernel, spelled the same way, Kernel, which is a BCI company, Neurotechnology, and it's based in Los Angeles, but it was founded in 2016 by Brian Johnson. And Brian Johnson he's LDS and he's from Utah. And it's working with this functional near-infrared spectroscopy system. And that's what Mary Lou Jepson is working on, the Silicon Hospital that Sean had told me about. So they're working on brain-computer interfaces as in neural prosthetics with this kernel technology. Because again, the kernel, like, you're not supposed to break into the operating system, but the neural prosthetics are going to try to break into the operating system. So here's Brian Johnson, and he was born in Provo, which is where the Mormon Transhumanist Conference on Blockchain was in 2022. And he was raised in Springville, Utah. He went to Brigham Young and University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And now he is as of 2016, the founder of this kernel company. So, so I thought that that's interesting. So within the popcorn problems, they talk a little bit, oh, this is on the ground. So we've got the pigeons, we've got the kernels, and then we have these pavers, which are asphalt pavers. If you're listening, I can't quite describe them. They're sort of like an offset rectangle. And they're a bit Escher-esque. So it's not quite like a herringbone brick. There's like little nodes, but these are tessellations. And so linked in the map that I have is I found this crazy paper. I don't even know what I was Googling, but it's talking about, the title of the paper is Tessellation, Shamanism, and Being Alive to Things. And it is a recent paper from August of 2023, and it was published in the Oxford Review of Education. The two co-authors are Ricardo Nemirovsky and Don Duprez. Okay, and to me, the tessellations remind me a lot of Roger Penrose and the Penrose tiling. Now, that tessellation didn't involve like a periodicity. They were just all pretty much the same. But the Penrose tiling has this periodicity, and aperiodic tiling is what it's called. And it relates to Escher. And of course, Roger Penrose is working closely with Stuart Hameroff on the source of consciousness, like non-local consciousness and microtubules. So I think it's all very interesting to see the tessellations in relation to how we understand our reality and consciousness and schizophrenia. And so I found this paper about tessellations and shamanism, and I thought, this is just crazy. So I'm going to read you the abstract, and it's very recent, okay? It says, now think about this too in terms of the Mercer Museum. This study examines the entanglement of affects. This study examines the entanglement of effects that occurred during a short episode at a science museum. The episode involved a small number of children and a teacher who had come to the museum in the context of a school field trip. It took place inside an exhibit called Hmong House, which represented various components of a traditional house of the Hmong people. A key aim of this paper is to trace, via microethnographic analysis of a brief video recording, an effective journey, AFFECTIVE, effective journey, meshing mathematical tessellation and Hmong shamanism. And in addition, we elaborate on the ways in which disparate themes, such as tessellation and shamanism, became interwoven in the life of those visiting the Hmong house at the time. The episode of the Hmong house may inspire other activities in which students or visitors with life trajectories partially rooted in indigenous cultures can share practices that are foreign to other students. The most important qualities of these activities, we suggest, are the respectful dignity with which they are demonstrated and engaged with, and the freedom to undertake interdisciplinary journeys without subjection to artificial disciplinary boundaries, in which improvisation and surprising turns are expected and ever present. So if you think about the museum maybe as a game board or a gaming experience, and this goes back to Moya and Elizabeth Merritt and the American Association of Museums and the Future of Museums, is using artifacts for children for project-based learning, right? Replacing schools with museums, and museums with these artifacts, because the artifacts are embedded in people's cultural identities are attached to artifacts that are embedded in environments. And now with spatial computing, it can all be monitored and logged and used for predictive analytics and pattern recognition and social computation. So again, they're using children and they're focusing on indigeneity in this context. In my opinion, the museum is game board. So if you look at Nemirovsky, he's from the University of Manchester, which is the Center for Graphene Research. and he's involved in embodied cognition of mathematical concepts in informal learning environments, right? And the informal learning environments are going to be the museums, among other things. And that's everything I've said about Knowledge Works. And again, Strive Together is the human capital arm of Knowledge Works. Is the goal is to get rid of public schools. So all of you school choice people or unschool or homeschool people, the goal is that you are the model. But before you're really excited about winning out as the superior model, understand that they're planning on having, through the graphene everywhere, right, in our clothes, in our food, in the air, in everything, right, and it's invisible, like electricity is invisible, that while you're participating in your independent study process, maybe with games and nudges and weights and choice architecture being logged, ultimately you're part of the computational system. You are the goal, right? And that's why the Jeffrey Yass is after the school choice model. And again, because choice is a choice architecture, right? That's part of informing it. And then eventually the charter schools will go away and the private schools will go away, and simply there will be roaming around kids in smart uniforms, maybe with some cello, beautiful money, courtesy of Charles Eisenstein and September. Okay, so here are some papers by Neberovsky, enriching learning experiences in science museums, communicating mathematics in museums, embodied mathematical cognition, because they want to use your body with math. And I think that's where the music comes in, that's where the dance comes in, that's where the drumming comes in. It's math embodied through the body, and that's where the shamanistic aspect, it's sort of the Platonic ideal of mathematics. Using motion detection in digital media, right? So spying on people in museums, eye tracking for the study of seeing and imagining, and this goes back to Bosnack's embodied imagination. And again, these are all children. These are children with a channel to the field, indigenous children, children of indigenous heritage with a channel into that field. That is something that the system very much wants. And they're going to do it through the idea of access and diversity, equity, inclusion, and uplifting cultural relevance, right? Like we've seen, and again, not that I'm against having culturally responsive education, but we have to understand the bigger game. So you look and you see at California these obligations towards ethnic studies, but that's because they actually want to use those people to get into the system, because that's how you get in, is through authentic cultural experience. And then they have like urban calculus. A video-based 3D motion detector, right? And this is spatial computing. You can't understand this outside of spatial computing. And this is from Manchester. Engage with graphene, and they've got all kinds of different graphene options that they're showing all the wonders of things that you can do with graphene. So we're all going to be surrounded in graphene, and to the extent that we can't even see it. So this is not something that's just in some sort of medical choice. This is something that becomes ubiquitous. Now, the other co-author is Don Duprez, who is a behavioral research in public health, big data analytics, and corporate consulting. And he was working with the Hmong community, right? He was working in Wuhan and he was working in Denver, right? So a lot of this stuff is happening in Colorado because it is a center of blockchain and Web3 and these sneaky policies and now Palantir, right? So knowing what's going on in Colorado actually really does matter. This is just pulling from his CV. Again, he's working in ethnography and medical anthropology, right? So these are people writing papers about spying on young indigenous children in museums who are like using imaginative and personal family histories and then analyzing that out. But somehow on the permission slip, there was a waiver that said, when the kids are on a field trip, you can do this. And I think this is really sad because clearly most people would not imagine that that's what you're doing. He's currently working for Amazon in Thornton, Colorado as it says proxemics manager. And so those are the people who are going to be tracking for pandemic purposes workers in logistical situations. So that's going to be smart wearables, right? And that's what they're going to put on the kids to track them. So he's a medical anthropologist working on on wearable technologies. Before that, he was working in behavioral science in California, Colorado, I don't know, PRC, Puerto Rico maybe, in the UK. So he's a general researcher across these different things. Oh, the People's Republic of China. Sorry, it's the Wuhan. Before that, he was with Google in Boulder, again, Colorado, doing metrics analysis of ethnographic interviews connected to Google Shopping. And I think it is in Denver where he connected with the Hmong community, because there's a lot of dislocated people there. And then let's see, he was at the University of Edinburgh as a graduate teaching assistant. So again, now we've got some of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry in Edinburgh. I'm pretty sure that Edinburgh is one of the other blockchain labs of Cardano. Again, Colorado. So lots of stuff to talk about in Colorado. I'm just saying here. And keeping going on, he was part of a Teachers for a New Era connection to China. Now, in my opinion, China, the actual stuff in China is not necessarily about the high-end AI and nano, but it's more about the old ancient knowledges about qi. And some of the stuff I'm going to be talking, well, I don't know if I should talk about it now or later, but it's thinking about qi and qigong and the I Ching and archetypal fields and hexagrams. I think what the West is interested in the East is very much the manipulation of the energy fields, and that's something that's been going on for a super long time, and we tell other stories to distract from that story. But the fact that he's working in Northridge, California and Wuhan in 2009 to 2010 is important. And his research there was supported by Carnegie Mellon Foundation. And before that, he was doing product design for online shopping, click mapping, and very much embedded in ethnography. His PhD in social anthropology was from the University of Edinburgh, and in languages it says that he has basic Mandarin and basic Hmong. So yeah, interesting. And okay, so this talks a little bit about the project. I guess that this was maybe done as part of his PhD work. And I'll just read it. It says, mission-based and scholarly research within the Denver Hmong community, the moral foundation of spiritual practice, and a profound emphasis on continuity have continued to uphold the idea of family as a central tenet to being Hmong. And in doing so, this has further emphasized various degrees of entanglement and mutual reliance within and between families and individuals. So I think about entanglement and thinking about quantum. And I do think that these ledger systems and the signals intelligence and the token trading is in itself part of energy entanglement. As a result, significant pressure has been placed on younger Hmong to strengthen networks of family, extended family, and community by reproducing and forming families of their own. The production and reproduction of family has in turn drawn into focus generational tensions concerning ideas of family, education, gender, expectations of behavior, and approaches to medicine, health, and healing. In consideration of these points, this thesis imagines how people within the Denver Hmong community negotiate, maintain, and contest the intersection of these matters while constructing and maintaining the central tenets of Hmong life and Hmong continuity through the reciprocal reproductive qualities of the social, spiritual, symbolic, and biological, right? So yeah, so he was using the Hmong community in Denver as a test bed, and this paper probably was sort of a result of that. So in this, we're talking about the tessellations, that's the abstraction. I'm just gonna hit on a few highlights of this paper. They're talking about care and new animism. And so I think this idea of animism and Gaia is really important. So this is from the paper, section 1.1, Care and New Animism. Care appears to be the mark of life. All living beings, cells, microorganisms, plants, and animals, to name a few, care. All groupings of living beings, flocks, shoals, music bands, trade unions, coral reefs, bodily organs, Gaia, care. Care entails being oriented towards and sometimes seeking. It is not just an expression of being alive, but borrowing Ingold's words, being alive to things. Care prompts past and future to flow into an enduring, shifting, contested present. Again, and this is the goal, to have a fluid reality that is not grounded. While this latter thesis is at the heart of being and time, because being in the world is essentially care, Heidegger, 1962. We note that beyond Heidegger's emphasis in his magnum opus, we see caring beings as not just human individuals or communities, but life in all its forms. And so I think that the life in all its forms is ultimately going to be down to the nanoscale, right? And we've seen this with Levin. He's like, the idea of life is going to go from like a couple cells on a Roomba to a person with a prosthetic, a neural prosthetic, or an arm prosthetic, or an exoskeleton. Like life is going to be all of these things, and everything in between is all of these chimeras. So this is what CARE is setting up. And I would just remind you that in the NF Tree project that I think came out of one of the Ethereum pitches, that they talked about documenting impact of monitoring forest and that it wasn't being logged as proof of care. So I think that using of this word care is really important. And then it continues on. Instead of thinking of care as summed up by the behavioral traits of a subject, it is more accurate to think of it as a medium, a caring continuum in which acts of willing, wishing, urge, or predilection come to be, but not the other way around. So I think the care is part of the entanglement. And so then the paper goes on to talk about that there's a display of a house representing Hmong in this museum, and how they analyzed it, right? The nuances looking at the children and the teacher, gestures, tone, body motion, pointing, words, of seeing what that this field trip experience was something to be studied. And that this is what spatial computing is going to do, what automated video recording is going to do. And they call this microethnography. And then they're doing photographic analyses. And this goes back to Bateson and Mead, where they're looking at the Balinese with these microethnographic studies. But now imagine, I've talked about the, this ant computer being like the machine, the outside-in robot, like the outside-in robot is your own therapist and anthropologist watching you. So the overall scenario is that there's a school field trip with 10 and 11-year-olds, and they're supposed to find tessellation. So this is the math piece. They're supposed to find math in these cultural environments, right? So there's a cultural environment, you're supposed to find something unusual, math. They're looking for patterns. Again, that's the schizophrenia part, is how do you find the pattern? They're having all these children go and look for patterns in non-traditional ways. You wouldn't necessarily think to look for a pattern in a piece of fabric, right? But this is like they're training the children up, again, enculturating them to this new plan of how they're going to be doing group problem solving. So they're walking through the museum, and there's, let's see, it says, Ruth and Sylvia attempt to regain Evelyn's attention, beckoning her to come see a tessellation Ruth has found on a quilt inside the house. But Evelyn's interest in the altar is too magnetic, which is an interesting choice of word, magnetic. And Ruth and Sylvia are ultimately drawn to the altar as well. When they arrive, Evelyn, this is a little girl, is bouncing up and down and singing frequency on a bench positioned at the front of the altar. And Ruth laughs a little and asks Evelyn if she sees any examples of tessellations. Because again, that's the assignment. And Evelyn is going off assignment, right? Evelyn is like one of the teens smoking at the flagpole. She's a rogue, right? She's not out in the program anymore, the fitness landscape. Because she has her heart resonance with this altar as her direct family lineage. She's not here just for an assignment. She has something meaningful that she's being connected to. And then it says, Evelyn replies yes and traces the pattern of paper cuts on the altar with her finger. And when Ruth asks if she would like to draw them, Evelyn sets to work and she starts drawing the shapes. And so she's got a worksheet, of course, because what would be school without a worksheet? And so she's doing that. And then I think Ruth is the teacher, and so she's engaging Evelyn, and Evelyn says that her grandma and grandpa are shamans, and then she starts telling a story about her family. And there's this sort of elaborate description of the ritual. And again, this is a young child doing this in a museum where all of this is being captured by cameras and videography that's automated and then being analyzed by anthropologists. But eventually the anthropologists are going to be AI, right? Because they're trying to figure out how to be human, because AI isn't going to be human, but they're still trying to figure it out. And so Evelyn, she's talking about her grandparents, and she's like, I know how to do these things. And then she starts demonstrating it. And then there's another boy who comes up, and he's like, I know about this too, because my family's connected to this. And so the anthropologists are transcribing all of this. And, they're talking about the tessellation. And of course, one of them is the honeycomb tessellation, these tessellation patterns. And it goes on, it shows like an image of the quilt. Again, it's a quilt that's really interesting. This is the worksheet that the kids are supposed to do, but then Evelyn is doing something beyond that. And there's some pictures about these are the pictures that the camera took and that they are analyzing, right? And so, this is Evelyn being very excited at the altar, and then the boy is coming up, and then they're looking at the altar together, and then the classmates come and they're doing it for the group. So this is one of these artifacts, and so I'm trying to sort of position again the future of museums and Elizabeth Merritt, who studied at the Forsyth Institute in Houston, which again, I think the Forsyth Institute, it's taken me years to understand that Forsyth, those people must be remote viewing, right? Or accessing the field in certain ways that they're pulling information back out. And so that's what the Forsyth Institute is doing, is pulling the information back out and then shaping culture to get into that direction. And so it just seems incredibly predatory. And let's see. So this is the interpretive commentaries. These are the analysts. In this episode, it is possible to recognize many circulating effects that intermingle with what Ruth, Evelyn, and Sylvia care about. And it's interesting because care, I think, love is the power that fuels this light-based reality somehow. That it is care and love and the heart field that really matters, that's driving the thing. That's the human energy, is the heart, just like Wrinkle in Time, like love wins. That's the key to this. And okay, so there's a caring about the altar, about the tessellations, about the papers, about Ruth and Evelyn and Sylvia, about the worksheet requests, about others coming in. These are caring things they're saying. Let's see. They're talking about affects, and then it says, as opposed to the continuum of light spectra, which is only inclusive of shades of color, life experience is a continuum for which nothing is necessarily or in an a priori manner excluded. Tessellation and Hmong altar can be part of a lived continuum as much as the Science Museum and English as a second language may be. This is a continuum along which paper hanging from a shelf can be tessellated and holy. So these artifacts are all part of extended cognition. That's the stuff I was talking about previously. Hmong traditions include reference to carefully cut and folded pieces of paper as symbolic money for the spirits. And while the ones Evelyn traced were made out of white sheets of paper, in other cases they include silver or gold rectangles representing ingots of precious metal, further marked by smaller red diamonds on its borders. This form of spiritual currency can be used in prayer, such as being burned for use by the spirits, or used decoratively as a form of acknowledgement and respect. The use of these papers is not strictly confined to shamanic altars and can be used for other practices involving spiritual matters, such as funerals. So it's interesting because later on, I found some things about origami and folded paper and three-dimensionality, and I think that's sort of related to the field and then coming into three-dimensional reality. Anyway, yeah, this is just sort of a transcript, and they're talking about the spirit world. And again, these young children are being the guides because the children are the ones for the field. And this is just, this is a little bit more information. But if you want to read this, you can read the whole paper. It's very long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But it's kind of intense, right? This is what I'm talking about. The future of education is non-traditional informal learning environments and spatial computing where children are being monitored individually and in groups to pull out patterns. And this idea of the, I think they call it the pluriverse, that we're not supposed to have one reality. It's supposed to be part of this continuum, and that the spirit and the family and the ancestor worship is part of that. And I really do believe that this idea of shamanistic practice, these are old ways of being, in this case, still active ways of being, where people have knowledges of interfacing with these information fields, with these energy fields, that I think at the highest levels, the people who are at the top of our material reality running things, they've known about this for a long, long time. And this goes back to the mystery schools and all of it. And it's deliberately kept from public knowledge and ridiculed as something that's ridiculous. But when Jung is talking about archetypes, and these archetypes are like the Platonic fields, and that the original archetypes come, maybe, I don't know, original, but the hexagrams in the I Ching, it's about managing the field, managing the beyond our senses, being able to get outside of our biology, which tells us which reality we're in, and accessing that and then linking it. And so I think that the protocol layer is actually very much about continuum of space-time and inner non-linearity in complex systems, and then documenting that for patterns and analysis, and using us as the agents, as the navigators, as the sailors of consciousness, of these conscious waters, to go in there. And they're especially talking about children. And in this, I have something called like creolization. Let me read this section. Let's see. The study of memory. A body of work has foregrounded that far from an inert or passive archive, the past is actively and relentlessly reformulated. Cultural memorization is an activity occurring on the present in which the past is continuously modified and redescribed, even as it continues to shape the future. So, like, again, I don't know, did I re-inscribe the past when I interrupted the guide and I said that Lloyds of London and these other Quakers were dealing in human capital as financial derivatives, even though they weren't directly selling slaves on the block, but that they were financially benefiting from the financialization of the slave trade? Because we're reformulating the past all the time. And was that why this woman was super annoyed? So somehow I energetically inserted some information that reformulated or reset the story about the big shoe? I don't know. It's interesting to consider. Okay, such broadening of the past beyond individual consciousness renders Bergson's diagram in serious need of deconstruction, because positing a multiplicity of cones does not illuminate their interplay across social, historical, and political platforms. Let's see. Oh, I don't have all of this. Like, creolization involves the pervasive presence of improvisational and future-oriented acts, which become small streams contributing to emergent languages. The present is a time of improvisation conditioned by a past that is partially unique to the individual, family, community, or tradition in question, and converts the past into a source of diversity. So that's interesting. And I'm thinking about that in terms of digital twins and the DNA work. I'm trying to, I don't have this picture of, oh, maybe I'll read this in this. I think this will be, I'll wrap up with this. The past and radical diversity. Any close analysis of a dynamic interaction is likely to reflect the radical diversity of ways in which things and people embedded in a certain caring continuum become affected by it. Each of the children and the teacher entering the exhibit during this episode inhabited the Hmong house differently. So imagine that every person is an agent and experiencing it from a different viewpoint, and that's all being recorded on the camera and analyzed. And I think that's something that, like Bosnak talks about in dreaming, is that in dream states you can embody a different perspective in the dream because you're all of the characters in your dreams. In Matter and Memory, Bergson included a diagram depicting memories contracting progressively from the distant past to the near past until they touch the plane of the present at the apex. The present that care actualizes action and willing to occur, because the past, which is in the immense interior of the cone, cannot be actual by virtue of belonging to the past. The past is powerless, and the present is sensory motor and therefore active. The past conditions without determining it. And while in recollection the past reaches the present rooted in a particular bygone event, in most cases the past contracts into the present in the form of habits or ways of being. The whole of our past psychical life conditions, our present state, without being its necessary determinant, whole, also reveals itself in our character, although none of its past states manifest explicitly in character. We strive to envision a correspondence to a shared past of community and practice. A first step is to think about each family, neighborhood, workplace, country, language, and so on, upholding its own cone, as it were, by means of an ongoing collective mnemonic practice. So it's the fractal nested nature, and I think maybe that's somehow how the fields, the morphogenetic fields, these information fields are being logged and tracked on the blockchain. So Anyway, I'm getting a little tired, so I think I'm gonna call it a night. Gonna set some intentions. I have a friend in from out of town today, and we're gonna go revisit the Noguchi Lightning Bolt and maybe see the Kelpius Cave and go to the waterworks, and because water is a big thing in all of this. So it's going to be a good day tomorrow, presuming it isn't pouring down rain. But hopefully you got something out of this idea of artifacts. And I do feel like, I am this cultural geographer. That feels like what I'm meant to be doing here. Again, I'm not a Mr. Curtis, and I'm definitely not a David Noble either. But I do like the idea of a community of shared practice held to a high standard, because this is super important. And as I said, my friend in Maine just brought to my attention that, yeah, educare hasn't gone away. The surveillance play tables aren't going away. XAPI isn't going away. The conductor isn't going away. Michael Matthias's game systems aren't going away. Live action role play isn't going away. Archetypes aren't going away. Community currencies aren't like all of these things are in play, and we need to become familiar enough with the concepts to have an informed opinion about them, and maybe hopefully explain them to other people and what our concerns are. And so there is someone that is offered to facilitate an exploration around that, starting with World Sensorium. And I hope maybe you can see how important World Sensorium is, given this idea of us as agents that are sensing and then using artifacts to embed our extended mind, and how those extended artifacts are used collectively in cloud minds, and how somehow that's moving through the space-time continuum. And I truly believe how we understand time traditionally is not what it actually is. And yeah, there's a lot to think about. So I'm going to put that person's email as a pin in the comment. And if you're interested in such a thing, you can send that person an email, and I'm sure they'll be in touch. And I'm not going to be active. I think there'll be like some occasional consultations with me, but this isn't like my group. This is a group that's looking into the ideas that I've been talking about, and it's super refreshing and really nice to hear that there's interest in that. So I wish that effort success. And so so think about the artifacts that you use. I've been really, we just had the realtor come take pictures of the house today, and all of the artifacts, things that I've taken, like I keep pruning down. I'm like, oh, I can take those to Goodwill too. I'm really down to the things that I think are meaningful to me, which, in some ways is good, I think. And it's interesting to think about, because I do appreciate handmade. I've got my sweater, I made a sweater, and I have these other things that are pottery. I love pottery, and I have this wooden spoon, hand-carved wooden spoon I was showing my friend today. So there are these artifacts that carry story, and how that fits in with museums, and again, spatial computing and children, and the signals intelligence, and new animism and care and proof of care. So this maybe wasn't the most comprehensive thing, but yeah, hopefully some food for thought. And just for the late Mr. Curtis, thank you for being a role model of high standards and the reward, even though we missed it by getting the stupid t-shirts with the grades on it, which was like, missed the point. Like I didn't know about David Noble back then, but that we collectively understood that we could learn even when it was hard, and do the work, and then come out the other side. And then some, I don't know what my other classmates are doing now. I don't expect any of them are doing exactly what I'm doing, but part of the step on my path to being a cultural geographer was world history, AP World History at South Mech High. So God bless you, Mr. Curtis, if you're up there looking at me. Know that I'm going to try to keep proving you proud. And Dr. Wilmans Wells, my cultural landscape thesis advisor at Penn, your family will be okay because you can see it. And that's what I keep loving my family, and I keep wondering if somehow there's some part of them that's trapped in Camazotz, and I need to keep working through this space-time continuum before I can figure out how to resolve our situation and bring us back to a healing place. So much love to everybody, and till next time.